from my perspective as an objective journalist, two things can be true at once. And that is that the October 7th attack, Black Saturday, was the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. And that the Israeli response to that attack had led to the highest death toll among Palestinians in the history of their people. And these things can be true at once, and we can provide the numbers of how many thousands of Hamas fighters were killed alongside those civilians. And that's what I try to do in Black Saturday, not take a position, not give an opinion about, I think, what most people can agree upon as an objectively horrible thing, a war.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we are honored to have with us Trey Yingst, who is the chief foreign correspondent at Fox News, and someone who, if you've been watching what's happening here in Israel over the past, obviously since October 7th, but even before, you've seen Trey all over the place, being in most dangerous areas. I think on October 7th, we'll ask him in a few minutes about it, and about his new book, and about what he saw with his own eyes on the ground. And I'll just give the credit for your new book, Trey, that's coming out really soon. Your new book is called Black Saturday, which is Shabbat HaShchora in Hebrew, the Black Saturday, an unfiltered account of the October 7th attacks on Israel and the war in Gaza. So, Trey, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
It's great to be on.
So, Trey, let's just start, I guess, from your book and just explain to us where you were on October 7th. I saw you were interviewed earlier this week, and you said you went down, you thought it was just a missile attack, and suddenly you hear gunfire and everything. Take us behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I get a call from my producer at 7:03 in the morning on October 7th, and we don't have much information. She just knows something is happening in the south, and we know there are rockets being fired into Israeli communities all over the country. And so we did what we always do when there are rocket attacks from Gaza, and that is go toward the Gaza border so that we can report and see some of the rockets coming out of Gaza, and also how the communities in the south are responding. And so we often report from a town called Sderot that sits on the Gaza border. It's got about 30,000 people in it, and it's filled with bomb shelters. And so that was our plan, to meet in Sderot on the morning of October 7th. And we made it to southern Israel around 8:30 in the morning. And we stopped just to the east of the city of Ashdod. We filmed some buildings that had been hit directly with rocket fire from Hamas as they were launching this attack initially. And then we kept driving south. We had planned to take a left around Yad Mordechai, drive along the road to get to Sderot, which is about a 5-minute drive, and then report from the city. And as we got to an intersection just before that left turn, we stopped. We saw an ambulance on the side of the road and some people, and we got out of the car and we could hear gunfire. And this was the first indication that we had this may not be a traditional rocket attack, and maybe it involves something else, a possible infiltration. At that moment, we could have never imagined that this was a widespread infiltration with thousands of gunmen crossing from Gaza into southern Israel. And so we did what we do. We started reporting and trying to get this information out in real time to our audience. But remember, on the morning of the 7th, we didn't know that anyone had been taken hostage into Gaza. We didn't know that people were being slaughtered in the communities that people would see them along the border. And so Black Saturday takes the reader through that day, what it was like for our team in southern Israel reporting on this massacre as it was unfolding before our eyes. And also you hear firsthand accounts from Israeli soldiers, Israeli civilians, from police officers, from hostages who were actually taken into Gaza and then released as part of the November ceasefire deal. I also speak with Israeli leadership like Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. I speak with Hamas leadership. I also speak with Palestinian civilians. And Black Saturday gives the reader a full account of October 7th and also the first 2 months of the war as the conflict unfolded.
Trey, also one other question. How many times were you in Gaza throughout this conflict? We're almost hitting a year. You were a few times. I know I've seen your stories that you've reported on Fox, but just give us a little bit of a sense of from the beginning when you got in the first time and then the last time you were there. What were the changes? What did you see in the way the war was being carried out? Just give us, even Israelis aren't a lot of times behind the scenes, so you're giving us the news too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've entered the Gaza Strip 5 separate times since the October 7th attack. And the access is restricted to military embeds only at this point in the war. We cannot enter Gaza independently, but we go with the military and see operations all over Gaza. And so I've reported from Gaza City, I've reported from Han Yunis and also from Rafah. And the assignments have been different every time in terms of what we see and what we cover. The first assignment that I ever went on was in early November into Joradik, just south of Gaza City. And we witnessed a firefight that was taking place between Israeli soldiers and Hamas. This was very early in the war. And so some of the images that we gathered later on, you could really contrast them to what it looked like at the beginning. There was far less destruction inside Gaza. There were less people that were displaced at this point inside the strip. And the Israelis hadn't even started to work on Han Yunis or Rafah, going after Hamas brigades there. And so some of the embeds included really dangerous assignments, such as a nighttime raid of the Shifa hospital that the Israelis went and conducted. And then we went afterwards to see what they found at the hospital complex. A week later, I returned to the same complex with Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari and went into the tunnel that they found beneath Shifa hospital. I also went into tunnels beneath the city of Han Yunis, and then most recently into the southernmost city of Rafah. And it was a variety of experiences that we saw. Some of them are included in this new book, Black Saturday. And I think one of the most interesting, actually, that stands out in my mind is that daytime embed to Shifa hospital, because not only was I speaking with the Israelis, I also spoke with Palestinian civilians who were at the hospital and taking a UN bus evacuating to the southern part of Gaza. And this piece is probably the piece I'm most proud of throughout the entire war, because I feel that it provides the most accurate reality of what is happening on the ground. And the fact that, from my perspective as an objective journalist, two things can be true at once. And that is that the October 7th attack, Black Saturday, was the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. And that the Israeli response led to the highest death toll among Palestinians in the history of their people. And these things can be true at once, and we can provide the numbers of how many thousands of Hamas fighters were killed alongside those civilians. And that's what I try to do in Black Saturday, not take a position, not give an opinion about, I think, what most people can agree upon as an objectively horrible thing, a war, but provide the facts and information and interviews to allow the reader to make their own assumptions and considerations about this story.
Yeah. And maybe one more question about that, because it is interesting. We all the time we hear, what do the people in Gaza think? What are they saying? And are they really allowed to talk? Because Hamas is very restrictive, and you've spoken with their leaders. I heard you say, and I think in the book you mentioned about them lying about basic things, that you were there in the Nova Festival, and they're saying, no, we went just to the army bases. So when you speak to people in Gaza, on the phone, in person, are they telling you, do you feel they're telling you the truth, or is there a sort of culture of fear behind the scenes which doesn't allow them to tell you exactly what they're feeling?
I think among the civilian population, they are telling the truth. And I think that many Palestinians I've talked to in Gaza and on the border have provided important insight to the realities of war for the Palestinian people, insight that's sometimes not covered here or in other media. And most recently, I think the best example of that is a story that I did on the evacuation of Palestinian children through the Kerem Shalom crossing. The Israelis and the Emiratis basically were able to evacuate more than 150 children and their families to Abu Dhabi to get much needed medical treatment. And I was able to speak freely with any of the Palestinians that were there. And they provided stories that were horrible about the conflict, about the realities of war. And I was able to, in my piece, include their voices, and then also a COGAT official, the Coordination for Government Affairs and Activities, to basically explain what they were doing and pose questions to the Israeli military branch that is responsible for getting aid into Gaza about what's actually getting into the strip and getting into the hands of the Palestinian people. And so from a civilian population, for the Palestinians, I have found that they have had a variety of experiences and opinions actually about the October 7th massacre and the war that followed. Their opinions tend to exist, like many opinions, on a spectrum. In terms of Hamas leadership and the previous people who controlled Gaza, that's very different. And I always try to distinguish those in my reporting and conversation because they certainly have an agenda. They want to sell me something in terms of information or spin on a story. And that's just not something as a journalist who reports straight down the middle is willing to accept. And so I will push back on claims that they make and also provide them with evidence about the reporting that I'm doing, even if they don't like it. Because I always tell people it doesn't matter, Israelis, Palestinians, Afghans, Ukrainians, Russians, it doesn't matter what story I'm covering. My goal as a journalist is to hold those in power accountable for their actions and get as close to the reality on the ground as possible while having a focus on the humans, the civilians who are most impacted by the conflicts that we cover.
I want to ask you about you obviously were in Israel before October 7th because you woke up and went to the south. So I guess this is my basically the last question of our talk because our time is limited. So maybe just a comment and then the question. This one comment that I want to say, which was optimistic, was I was this week in Sderot and everybody pretty much moved back to the city. It's an amazing thing. Less than a year ago, the place, everybody moved out or evacuated. So I think just in that sense, it's optimistic that an area which was totally decimated is coming back to life. That's, I guess, think we should tell our viewers, our listeners about what you said. And so you were there, you know how badly people there were being hit. My question is, you were here, you saw the protests on the streets in Israel, you saw Tel Aviv being blocked, hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting their government. Then on October 7th, you go down south, you start seeing people just volunteering and driving down south to protect their family, friends, citizens they don't know, dying for people they don't know. And then today we're back on the protests again for different reasons. But my point is, what do you think, just as someone looking in from the outside, about Israeli society? Where are we going? What do you think? Just, it's interesting to ask someone like you because you don't have an agenda.
Israeli society is certainly divided, not just on the war, the situation with the hostages, who we should note are still being held inside Gaza nearly a year into this conflict.
Yes.
And it is a variety of responses that I receive when I speak to the people in the streets of Israel, because we go to Kaplan sometimes to report on the demonstrations that take place even now. And we reported extensively on the judicial reform demonstrations. I interviewed Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, one-on-one about the judicial reforms last year. And I've been in the streets. I've talked with the opposition in Israel. I really talked to everyone involved. And I'll say two things. Certainly, we've seen a shift in the demonstrations. The focus before October 7th, for people who maybe aren't as read in, the focus there was mostly on judicial reform and some pressure on the current government that is arguably the most right-wing government in Israel's history, based on the coalition that the prime minister has had to form to stay in power, because it's 120-seat Knesset. You need 61 seats to rule, and no one has it. So you have to build a coalition government, and that's what the prime minister has done to stay in power right now. And so after October 7th, though, we did see this period where the country really came together. They understood that there was an attack. They had to basically initially respond to that attack and then secure the border with Gaza and then prepare for the war that would follow. Since then, the division in the Israeli society has certainly gotten wider again. We've seen that with the weekly demonstrations that take place, sometimes 500,000 people in the streets of Tel Aviv. And so there's that shift in the demonstration. That's the first thing that I'll say in terms of the topic. And I would say that the second thing that I find is that even for those who are demonstrating now, their reasons for being in the streets vary. And I found this quite interesting, actually. A few weeks ago, we were at one of the demonstrations talking with people. And for some people, they were there just to show solidarity with the families of the hostages that remained inside Gaza. Other people were there to call for change in the government, to call for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to step down. And we even found people there who were in the streets because they wanted to encourage the current leadership, the prime minister, to not fight Gaza. And so there's a variety of reasons that people are demonstrating. They're frustrated with the current process. Some are demanding an agreement to get the remaining hostages out of Gaza, even if that means stopping the fighting in the south and in the north. But as we speak now, I'm reporting from the northern city of Haifa. We've seen rockets coming in today, sirens going off in the distance, and some of the rockets slamming into the port just off to my side here. And the war continues. It's expanding and it's changing. And it will be interesting to see how this affects the Israeli society, because as we've seen historically, when there are larger conflicts or wars that erupt, the society does come together in some capacity. And so my sort of concluding thought to all of this, and I write a lot about this in Black Saturday in this new book that's coming out, because I wanted to talk to everyone that I could about what happened on October 7th, how that changed the fabric of the society, how people came together initially, and how that's changed as the war has gone on. I actually interview Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, a number of times throughout the reporting for this book. And I think that probably is one of my biggest takeaways of the writing process of this book, because the access is truly unprecedented to be able to speak with an Israeli official who still, as we are talking, is sort of calling the shots on the military front in this conflict. And so his conclusion was that he will continue to stay in his position as long as possible and focus on efforts to defend Israel, not just in the south, the north, and other threats that the country faces. And the politics will be left up to other people. And that was just sort of one takeaway from Black Saturday that I think you'll find when you read the book and you learn about what happened on that horrific morning of October 7th and then the war that followed.
Do you think, just as a closing note, that one of the things that we've been talking about in Israel was how much did the rift within Israeli society, the fact that so many reservists were signing these letters saying that they won't come to volunteer anymore, all of these different things were showing the enemy, our enemies in Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., that maybe Israel isn't as strong as we thought. Maybe the Israeli society is collapsing from within, and let's, take advantage of that. So do you think, just by talking with Hamas leadership like you did they was that one of their takeaways, one of the reasons maybe for doing October 7th when they did it?
I could tell you actually from the perspective of the soldiers that I interviewed inside Gaza, because I asked them about the disagreements in Israeli society about how to conduct the war, when to conduct a ground operation, all of these things. And their focus was on fighting the conflict. And oftentimes they didn't have any comment about the political disagreements that were taking place in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem because they were so focused on the war. Hamas leadership largely was the same. They were talking about the conflict and the Israeli air campaign, often against Gaza. They were stressing the civilian casualties that were rising as a result of that air campaign. And certain questions they answered and other questions they didn't. But look, my job as a journalist on the ground is to continue to pose those questions to both Israeli leadership and Hamas leadership to try and get our viewers and my readers in Black Saturday a better understanding about this conflict as it still continues today, and it changes each and every week.
Well, it's continuing in a different area now. So we're pretty much, I think we could say that Gaza is basically holding it. The lines are being held. There's no major action happening now. So everybody moved up north and you're there. So Trey, I wish you success and keep safe. And it's important to talk to you for Israeli listeners, and we'll translate this to Hebrew so people could read and hear what you have to say. And I do think that you're doing a great job in a world where most journalists have an agenda. You seem, from what I watch you a lot, I'm a very big Fox viewer, so it's fun to, and it's encouraging to see someone like you writing about your experiences and talking about them. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.